Thank you, Michaela and Frank, for joining us tonight on what is the final public program in conjunction with Rodney McMillian, A Son of the Soil. I'd like to begin by briefly offering some framework for our conversation tonight, which will broadly address Rodney's work in relation to the histories of abstract art. So the exhibition highlights a variety of discrete bodies of work across McMillian's oeuvre, which both kind of holistically and deliberately address a range of historical contexts: social, cultural, political, national, even regional conversations. And the work itself ranges really widely, from abstract landscape paintings that you'll see in Gallery 1, to large-scale works in stitched vinyl at the conclusion of the exhibition, to videos, still life painting, and so on. So all of these strategies are really self-consciously deployed by the artist to resonate within certain historical contexts, including the history of art, the history of modernist painting, certainly the history of 20th century abstraction. So for me, this conversation is really hinged on the notion of reception. That is, how do we respond to the work? How are we asked to respond to the work? Knowing something about the history of 20th century painting, alongside the histories of class, race, economics, violence, all of these things that Rodney is really foregrounding in his oeuvre. And I'm showing here, well, on the next slide, I'm showing here a work which is in the final gallery of the exhibition that is drawn from a series of large-scale stitched vinyl works, abstractions, which Rodney calls sky paintings. And so this is not a painting in the literal sense, in that it actually doesn't include any paint. But we receive it as a painting because it's located in painting's traditional viewing position, on the wall, upright on the wall. And so we're asked to think about it as a painting and in the context of the history of painting. And this work in particular, I think, with the juxtaposition of these stark geometries, darkly colored vinyl and fabrics, which reference and evoke skin, perhaps the suggestion of body parts, all of these things kind of conceptually commingling beauty and violence, and also perhaps aspiration, really serves as a synthesis of a lot of Rodney's ideas that are located throughout all of his bodies of work. And so the question to keep in mind tonight as we go through our discussion is, how does the history of abstraction add further context to works like this? So, on the topic of reception, I'd like to begin with you, Frank, and sort of ask you broadly to discuss your response to the exhibition.
To the exhibition as a whole.
However you wish to take it.
Right, so I was really angry when I saw the exhibition because I was overwhelmed and it was too much and I just couldn't even begin to grasp any of it because it was an input overload. And I loved it. I mean, it was just, I had to sit down and get up and walk around. And this wonderful young woman in the galleries asked me, because I guess I'm in my male hot flash, I was perspiring and crying and whatever I was doing in the gallery. And she said, oh, well, which piece is your favorite piece? And I was so shocked that she had asked me a question as I was trying to take this in. I told her, I don't know if that's the appropriate question. I don't know if I could have a favorite piece in this exhibition because of how it's such a sensual assault. Now, this piece in particular, and the sky paintings in general, which is made of, they're made of vinyl. And I think some of it is actually naugahyde. Everybody know what naugahyde is? People remember. It's the thing you put on the couch, and it looks like it's imitation leather, but it's a polyvinyl acetate. It's a plastic, and it's a petroleum byproduct. But it immediately made me think of. Are you familiar with the painting of a photograph of Peter, who was from Baton Rouge, who was the soldier from Louisiana who escaped, and his back is lacerated and has been leatherized because of the abuse. And the stitching and the plasticity made me think of skin right away. So that was overwhelming, and I had a series of, I had to come and see the show 4 or 5 times because it's so foul that it just, And I say foul in the sense that it demands so much of us as the audience. My initial response was, how did this get into Columbia? How is the audience receiving this work, which is so powerful and important and intellectually demanding? How are the people responding to this? And that's why when Wilson asked me and told me that Michael and Michaela were going to be discussing it, I immediately said yes before I didn't even think about it, because it's exactly the kind of show that we need to be discussing in this part of the world right now. So, in a nutshell, that's my initial response. And I'll stop because I can overwhelm.
Well, you brought up the photograph of Peter, and showing as a comparative example the Sherman Fleming work, which perhaps you want to respond to or discuss, Michaela.
I think you can't look at this body of work or Rodney's work, period, without thinking about the body. Even when it's absent, it's present. You know, from the naugahyde vinyl pieces that really give you the sense of damaged skin, stressed skin, or the landscape paintings, which bring labor back to landscape, so that the body is always present. The body is present through work. The body is present in all of the work in its absence, and then appears again through the video work. So you can't think about the work without thinking constantly about its relationship to the body, and particularly the black body in this country, the violence visited upon that body. This is Sherman Fleming as a rock. You know, I think the interesting connection between Sherman and Rodney is how much of their performance work involves these interventions or interruptions in public space, all involving public interaction with the body. So you just can't escape the presence of the black body when visiting this work, and all of the histories that accompany that.
And there is this notion, I think, in the videos in particular, it's something we have been talking about as sort of ancestry as a site of performance. So the most recent video that was created in the lead up to this exhibition was filmed largely in Middleton Place, just outside of Charleston, and also the video culminates in Charleston at the City Market. And I know that Rodney was really interested in the idea of having a kind of menacing character, stalking the grounds. And he was thinking very much about the Stono Rebellion, right, at that time, which was in proximity to that place. So what is this? What is the power of ancestry in place, and perhaps relating it back to the history of performance in the 20th century?
Well, he dedicates this piece to Jimmy. And Jimmy was the leader of the Stono Rebellion, and we think he was Congolese. He was a Congolese warrior, and he spoke Portuguese, and he was Catholic. And he was the leader of, I think it's about 20 enslaved people who rebelled against their condition, and they gathered up, I think altogether maybe 60 or more enslaved people, and they were able to, some of them did escape, and their intention was to go probably to Fort Mose, which is down in Florida, not far from St. Augustine, which was an encampment of Africans and Seminoles who were used for the Seminole War, which lasted something like 40 years. So it refers to these other acts of rebellion against the condition of enslavement precipitated by self-emancipating Africans, like the Maroons, who had settlements throughout South Carolina, Virginia, Florida, and Georgia. And the thing I was entranced by is he created a mask which you cannot see. It's gauze. Obviously, he can see through. But it's a faceless mask, and he's dressed as a workman, as if he's working on the plantation. And so it makes this analog, and that is part of what's so much of what Rodney McMillian is doing. He creates these analogies and metonymies I'm going to explain if someone doesn't know what a metonymy is. It's just one thing substituted for another. That, like, if you see the White House and you think of the current regime in Washington, that's a metonymous association. But he creates these associations that are so pregnant with possibility, with reference. And in this case, the faceless black worker who ends up picking up a rifle. And the steps he's walking up, I think those are apartments for the descendants of the Middletons that are on the grounds of Middleton Plantation. So he was going to kill the people in those apartments, I think that's what that was. I mean, because I haven't been to Middleton in quite a long time. And the original house is burned, but there's a remnant of part of the house that's there, and then there are apartments where descendants, I think, are able to stay on the plantation. They can reserve space there.
Those are actually what he was walking. That was the inn.
Oh, the inn on Middleton.
Yeah, which I think was built in like the 1980s. And
yes, it's recent. And so he's walking up the steps to attack we know not whom. And so as he lurks through the grounds, and the tourists are there, and they're ignoring him, and then it ends when he goes into the market. And the thing that I noticed immediately was there were very few Americans of African descent in the Charleston market. And the Charleston market is one of the places I think is supposed to be a site where enslaved people were actually auctioned off. And so it's interesting who is consuming the residual product that's there, who is consuming it, who is not consuming it. And he is making a statement about that, both directly and by allusion, by just walking through the crowd, and who looks at him and who doesn't look at him. And I noticed that at the very end, there were several Americans of African descent who walked through and are coming to the market, and they, especially the man, looked at him. But most of the time, the other people just, they were oblivious, except when he got onto the street and there were some women who looked at him. But those responses by the audience spoke to me about aspects of our experience, about aspects of what happens with the invisible man.
I think it's also a direct reference to time, right? So there are all these references to speculative African fiction, moving back in time, traveling forward in time, coming back to present. So he's walking through time. But the presence of the black body is the same in each portion of time. It's there as threat. It's there as a site of violence. But he's moving through time, and the threat is always present. And connecting him back to other performance, Sherman Fleming has a piece called Noose, where he spent a year walking around doing his daily activities with the noose around his neck, right? And kind of recording the responses to the public. And like Rodney, there's an awareness of his presence, but nobody will acknowledge him.
And there's a part where he's standing before, there's a part where he's standing in the noose before mannequins who are in colonial dress. And the mannequin's inability to respond to him is part, I think, of what is being said. He becomes the articulated black body, and these inanimate, these well, they're not automatons. These things are there that cannot respond to his humanity at all, and that was distressing. The other thing that was the same theme was when in the migration piece, the movement through time is really evident through that. And Michaela works with the body also, so I'm going to ask her to just talk a little bit more about, because I really responded to that piece because it starts on a homestead, and then it moves through from the State House to the political aspects of what that means, and the flag was there, and it ends up in New York City in a festival. So would you just talk about it a little bit?
Well, I think the thing that's striking to me is that some of it is a direct reaction to the built environment. There's the kind of vernacular built environment of this house where he starts. And then he moves to these great cathedrals of American power. And it is the same black body moving through these spaces, responding in time to this built environment, even the objects that he chooses on which to create, like these sheets, these post-consumer objects that he's painting on, are a reference to the body. The body is present in its absence. And the threat is present always.
You've gone to the post-consumer route. I wanted you to actually talk a little bit about Ultraman and the character that he uses because of its similarity for me to the masks and the objects of the Sinufo in particular, but also there are idols, reliquaries, I think in the Akan, that are made of metal that are very similar. And so he uses something from Ultraman, from a cartoon, or from an anime character that's in modern life, but it seems to refer to, although it's Japanese, I think, actually, in origin, but it seems to refer to the masking in Africa as well. And the other thing he's doing with the masking, he completely covers his body. His hands are covered. He has on a mask, either the blank mask that is faceless, or he has on the Ultraman mask, or the what looks like the Iron Man mask when he's washing the grave sites. And this is very definitely related to African masking, where the power of conveying the spirit causes you to cover all parts of your body, so that it's to protect you and the audience from the power of what's going through you.
I think the masking is also just, a reference to being both highly visible and invisible at the same time, right? So there is this idea that you are both present and invisible. So he's working there, and a lot of Black labor historically has been about being invisible, being in the space, working in the space, but being invisible. And you are at once a threat and invisible all at the same time. And the contradiction there. So the masking to me feels like an opportunity to demonstrate that kind of invisibility and hypervisibility all at the same time. I think choosing to wear a mask also was an opportunity to invoke a spirit. Mm-hmm. And he's covered both as his character in this dark robe, but he's also covered in work garb. So labor is also always clearly present.
Yeah, that's interesting, the notion about conjuring a spirit. So I was giving a tour of the show, and one visitor was responding really to the stitched vinyl pieces. And she said, "Is he a mystic?" Which I thought was really interesting. It gave me pause. I had to think about it for a moment. And ultimately, I'm not sure that there's a mystical quality to the work, and I'm not sure that he's consciously kind of doing that, but he is clearly conjuring ideas and histories and stuff from various sources that I think ultimately transcends the objecthood of them.
Well, if I jump in. Well, since abstract expressionism actually has its origins in mysticism, because one of the first abstract expressionists was Hilma af Klint, who was this Nordic mystic. I think she was a theosophy adherent. And that, of course, leads to Vasily Kandinsky and coming out of Russia. So this idea of transcending the object, transcending the world of material reality is part of what the origins of abstract expressionism would have. And I think Jackson Pollock is, because he'd seen sand paintings by indigenous communities, and so that was part of the ethos of this form. And then strategically, Americans of African descent used abstraction in varying ways. And that's so dense. I don't know if I can, because each artist is using something different. Now, for example, I would ask Michaela to talk about Donaldson and how he uses abstraction, because he was a part of Afrocobra and Obok before that, I think. So would you talk about that? Is Seitu Aminawasu here by any chance? He's not. But would you talk about that just a little bit?
Donaldson's work used abstraction through improvisation and pattern form, right? So he was still making figurative work, but abstracting the forms, elongating, stretching, dancing the figures, really. And I think of that really differently, I think, than when I think of artists using pure abstraction. Alma Thomas, there's rhythm, but the figure is missing, right? I think of Sam Gilliam, particularly of the hung pieces where, you know, the form is the reference, the form is the rhythm, the form is the abstraction, but the figure is not clearly present.
Well, the painting becomes the figure. With Sam Gilliam, the painting becomes the figure. He rearranges the painting. He turns the painting into a wall sculpture. And that is also what's happening to some extent with the vinyl pieces. They're assemblages. So they're presented as paintings, but they're actually the assemblage form. And so there are all these different strategies with abstraction, because we didn't really talk about what we mean by abstraction yet. So when I'm dealing with students, I usually say if the work is a true abstraction, a pure abstraction, then it is a material thing that really represents a conceptual event. And that means you cannot see it except for the decision of the artist to share it with you. And here we have two works by Alma Thomas, and I asked to have these shown. One is actually an eclipse, and it looks like an eclipse, and it refers to an eclipse, and so it has a sort of figurative ethos. The other, the autumn leaves fluttering in the wind, they're not leaves. They're just dabs of paint, and it's really a relationship between the colors, because you have the orange and the blue, and you have this complementary relationship between orange and blue, and you have the orange as a yellow derivative. And so she was really working as a kind of, she was influenced by color field painting, but also by gestural abstraction. So there are many different layers of how these different artists, whether they're African American or just, you know, from wherever they are using abstraction, there are many different ways in which they're engaging with abstraction, and there are differing forms of abstraction. So I'm thinking that Rodney McMillian's principal form of abstraction is conceptualist, in that the idea is being created by us, especially when he introduces words. Oh, you
Got a new meaning.
Used to sharing now.
Right. Michael, would you say that part of his relationship to conceptual work and a lot of Black conceptual abstract work has to do with finding context for the body? So it's, the abstraction happens through context, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that much of his formation as an artist can sort of be credited to Charles Gaines, and studying with him at CalArts, and I think I have a slide here of Charles Gaines. So Gaines, I mean, very much in the legacy of, in the lineage of CalArts, which is like founded in the early 1970s, John Baldessari starts this post-studio course where it's really not about form per se, and it's not about, you know, necessarily generative physical making, but it's about exploration, and he's encouraging experimentation. And, you know, he would walk his students through nature. He would hand them catalogs and things like that.
But also about systems and frameworks.
And also, yes, exactly. And I think Charles Gaines took that to the next level. Here we go. So he's very interested in structure. And one thing that I think Rodney really absorbed from Gaines is that they're both really interested in the concept determines the form at the end of the day, which is why Rodney can be so fluid across media. And there are times when the body is really clearly and obviously referenced, right? And that's sort of a conceit of the exhibition, where the body continues to appear in every gallery in different forms. But he's very keen to say, you know, the idea is the thing that determines what material will be utilized, which very much relates to, because he's so conscious of the reception of how these paintings, sculptures, photographs, whatever they may be, have come down to us throughout history, and how we have received them through, in some ways, indoctrination, right? And some days we've been indoctrinated in the history of art in the same way we've been indoctrinated in everything else. So it's deeply ideological.
Well, I think it also raises a question about, it brings us to the question of material and ephemerality, because you're talking about all of these works that have come down to us because they've survived, right? And Rodney's choosing to use materials, many of them petroleum-based, you know, which is a real conversation about how those products impact the lives of Black people. but also about, how the work survives. So again, it's context. Like, what happens to the work in 40 years? Is he concerned with that? I've heard him say that he's concerned only with the present, that the past and the future are both fiction.
Well, I'm thinking of the piece, the three stumps, where and that's latex. It's latex as opposed to acrylic paint. Acrylic paint has a slightly higher quality and it's probably going to be a bit more archival. Latex is on this unprimed sheet. And so that thing is going to degrade over time, and it can't even be shown in the light because the ultraviolet radiation would just cause it to disintegrate and discolor it even more so. But it's about the recontextualization of that material because it's a sheet that somebody used, and the tag is still there where he had acquired it in a thrift store. And so the value, I think it's $4.99. It's a $5 sheet on that. Now, I don't know what the market value of the piece is now, but the idea of value is inhered in that, and it also automatically implies the body because it's a sheet, because it was on a bed, and because of your relationship of the viewer to the spectator to that object. Now, the other argument I have is always thinking of these as landscapes. Because ordinarily the sheet it's on the bed, it's broke, but this sheet is upright, and the figures that are on it, I guess they could be reposing, but the implied figures, they're not really figures, they seem vertical. And it brings home to me immediately your relationship to these figures and to this bed cover. The other thing was the couch, which really struck me, because the first thing I realized about the couch was if I'm looking at the couch, this is my right. This is my left, actually. This is my right. But on the couch, the other person is in the opposing position. Their right is on my left. So the couch is in part about positioning, and then it's divided in half, and then it's thrown back together with cement. And when I saw that, I really, I think I may have laughed out loud, but I also thought about this deal that they're trying to make in Iran, I'm sorry. But piecing things together with disparate parts, putting together what is not going to match. And that's what society does. That's why we have this communicative facility we have to speak, to talk to each other, to work things out, to use diplomacy, which I'm not going to be bad. I'll be good. But all of these things are implied in this exhibition, and that to me is what was so overwhelming, and why I had to come back 15 times, because it's just like I could only go through a little bit of it at a time. I had to break it up because there's so much information that is there, which is pointing to something about him and his intellect and his training and all the things that have happened in his life, but also that he and Charles Gaines are from South Carolina, because Gaines was born in Charleston and McMillian was born here. And so I was like, these people with these enormous brains were educated. Well, no, well Gaines left because he went to
Newark.
Yeah, went to New York. But still, he was born. It's South Carolina genetics. Mm-hmm. It's a body from South Carolina.
Well, you also kind of alluded to like the effort of discourse, right? And that's what I really think about with the couch in particular. Is like it's literally bifurcated, right? It's literally polarized. And you think also about the effort of making it, which is another through line throughout the exhibition, all of the vinyl being hand-stitched.
Well, in this couch, it's a polyester couch, is what I'm thinking. Because
I would imagine so.
Yeah, it's polyester. And it has the beautiful stitching of the flowers. I don't know if they're chameleon. I looked at that couch very carefully.
It was Rodney's couch.
It was his couch. So I was wondering if it was like an Edwardian stuffed couch, or does he know what period is it federal period? Does he know what period it's from? And it has a certain elegance. Mm-hmm. So what made him decide to saw the couch in half and then join it with cement? Did you talk to him about that?
I think it was about I think it was just offering kind of this dualist
Contrast
kind of
materials.
contrast between hard and soft, intractable and pliable and things like that.
I find it really interesting that you're drawn to this kind of delicate nature of this couch, and most of the materials that he's grabbing for, he's reaching for them because of their accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a through line there. That is kind of the tradition of conceptual Black abstractionists. I think of David Hammons and the Blizzard sale, right? Mm-hmm. So that context adds the value. So all of these materials are easily accessible. He didn't grab a really expensive couch. These are sheets from the thrift store. These are all materials that are readily available and readily understood.
Well, the other piece that I was also struck by that caught me unawares was inside the president's mouth.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of these, but that one where he's taken the strips and he's, in a sense, recreated the shapes of teeth by having the individual strips. And you think of all the things in your mouth. Your mouth is one of the most germ-infested places on your body. And so he's created this, again, I guess, a kind of interior landscape of colors, and it immediately evoked blood and bile and saliva and all these ideas. And then there's in the essay, is Sade here? Irony? No. In the essay, Sade wrote the essay with, who was it?
Brooke Wyatt.
With Wyatt. And they were talking about the fact that the president, the first president, this very powerful man, was enabled by having the teeth of the enslaved in his mouth. And some of them, I think there might have been hippopotamus ivory and teeth. It's unclear how those teeth were acquired and what they were. But I think it was possible that enslaved people could sell they could simply not body parts, but their teeth. There's this horrible myth of the black leg from Saints Cosmas and Damian. That's part of the iconography in Spain, where they cut off the leg of a black man and they sewed onto the leg of a white man. And I think it's supposed to show some kind of shared humanity, but they completely disregard the humanity of the black person by taking his leg and adding it onto the white person. And it's one of the miracles that's performed. I guess it's a kind of healing, a kind of miracle that is, a verification of the strength of faith. But in this case, where you have the thing that makes it possible for you to survive, because you have to eat your food, you have to chew your food in order to survive. The fact of George Washington's strength is determined through the presence of, in his head, the teeth of enslaved people. That really struck me. That really was like, okay, this interdependence in this country is so essential, is so much a part of the fabric of what the country is, that the president, the first president of the United States, was kept alive by the teeth of enslaved people. When you think of what he's citing for us there, it shows this shared humanity in one sense, but this incredible exploitation in the other sense.
Simultaneous revulsion and desire,
Yeah.
hypervisibility and invisibility.
And I think it's also really relevant. So you can't see it in the image, but it's white on white text that says George Washington chewed his food with the teeth of slaves in his head. And I think it's also interesting that he said head and not teeth and not mouth, because to me it adds a sense of brutality actually to it.
But his head, the seat of his personality, the thing that motivated everything about who he became and what he was to the country. Yes, it's that kind of enabling it's the kind of thing that makes art just, so extraordinary in terms of how the individual is able to communicate things to us that you would not ordinarily have thought of. And I did do the George Washingtons, and I have the Roy Lichtenstein, and I had the Athenaeum portrait of George Washington there, the one that is the inspiration for the dollar bill, because I always talk about these two, because in trying to help my students understand the difference between what is realistic and what is simply representational, this was something I would use in a didactic sense for them to see the basic forms of this piece, the Lichtenstein, which uses the min dots and refers to commercial design and refers to the whole idea of mass reproduction, which then therefore alludes to the image of Washington on the dollar bill, compared with what Gilbert Stuart's trying to create in terms of a myth of this American hero who is slightly condescending, who's looking at us from a certain position. And this was the portrait he used to make all the other portraits, the Lansdowne portrait and all the 130 other portraits that he passed around to spread the propaganda about Washington, who Washington was, and how important that was to cementing the American ideal, the American dream. So to have these images of Washington, one sort of pop image of the influence of commercialism and reduction of Washington's reputation in the modern age, and then the idealized portrait in this sort of neoclassical style that is establishing the myth, and then the Rodney McMillian portrait going inside the person. To me, that was just an incredible, to have that series of images in my head is the kind of thing that was overwhelming me, which made it impossible to get through the show in one sort of, it was just too much. It was so incredible, wonderful, incredible, but a lot.
I think throughout the show you get the sense that you're being seduced by these really lush, beautiful images, and then you get punched in the mouth, right?
Yeah.
You're drawn in, and then you read the text.
Yeah, there is, I mean, so this painting comes from a relatively recent body of works with which Rodney started in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. And many of the pieces in Gallery 4 deal with, they're abstract paintings that incorporate text that's drawn from various sources, and all of the text basically relates to histories of violence against the black body in America, especially with reference to the medical state, essentially.
Particularly black women.
Yes.
Yes, and
Yeah.
yes, that's true. That gallery particularly deals with black women.
Well, that also was very striking to me, that he has a quote from women who are trying to establish access for black women's health, and he'll have an example of some horrific thing that was done, like Fannie Lou Hamer's hysterectomy, or the likelihood of women surviving pregnancies. And in South Carolina, we're one of the worst states. We're one of the bad places. And of course, you have the reduction in access to health care because of the defunding and removal of facilities for women who are impoverished because of the conditions of what's referred to in the show by slavery and by the whole history. So the show has such a powerful, again, when I saw the show, I was just, how did this get to Columbia? How is this possible? How could you have an image of a black dick in the museum in Columbia? Because that's just very, and I should say the phallus of an African American male, or of the phallus of an African male, as part of this installation. But of course, it's not an actual phallus. It is a sculpture in chicken wire covered over to look as if it's been tarred and feathered, tarred. And it is also an allusion simultaneously to Robert Mapplethorpe, to Andy Warhol, to this history of the objectification and representation of black male bodies as well as female bodies. So if you have that repertoire of imagery in your head, again, walking through the show is walking through time. It is walking through history. It is walking through not just transgression, but it's also walking through the intellectualization of how we do and don't talk about these things that are so fundamental to how the society is structured. We need to discuss these things.
And you can't get to any of that without thinking about the text and its use of text. And not grandiose text, but often text coming from common man. Simple, elegant words that describe the condition of living here as a black person.
Well, you just brought up flag, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if we can read it.
The image is not great.
It's not, well, I brought my computer because I wanted to read flag. Flag says, I put my life on the line for this country. To me, not voting is not right. It led to a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. My son's in Iraq, in the army, just like I was. My oldest son, he fought in the first Persian Gulf conflict. He was in the Marines. This is my baby son over there right now. But I'm not able to vote. They say I owe $900 in fines. To me, that's a poll tax. You've got to pay to vote. It's restitution, they say. I come off parole on October 13th of 1999, but I'm still not allowed to vote. Last time I voted was in '88, Bush versus Dukakis. Bush won. I voted for Dukakis. If it was up to me, I'd vote his son out too. I know a lot of friends got the same cases like I got, not able to vote. A lot of guys doing the same things like I was doing, just marijuana. They treated marijuana in Alabama like you committed treason or something. I was on the 1965 Voting Rights March from Selma. I was 15 years old. At 18, I was in Vietnam fighting for my country, and now unemployed, and they won't allow me to vote. Clinton Drake in 2004.
So what is the flag without the franchise, right? So it's talking about these systems and putting them in context to the experience of being a Black American. And, you know, in this climate where voting seems to be under siege.
Well, having a voice. Having a voice is under siege. People being robbed of their ability to participate in the franchise of the American enterprise in general. And it's just happening in real time. Oh,
So,
this is another favorite. Sorry, yeah. So the reason this is a particular favorite is the structure, this disintegrating, melted. So the Supreme Court is this solid, neoclassical, big white marble building. It's turned into a sponge, essentially. It's just disintegrating before our eyes. And the thing that I love most is subtractive. I think it's an egg and dart motif on the front. So the references to classical architecture and then making them by omissions. I don't know why that spoke to me.
and the court, the way it's painted is suggestive to me of a sky, so that you could see through it. And the fact that it sort of juts out into the viewer's space, where you could almost step on it, please don't, is suggestive, of course, of the court's policies having these real downstream effects on people's everyday lives.
Bleeding out into us.
And he created this piece in 2000, it's dated 2004 to 2006. He was thinking about, at that time, the election of Bush versus Gore, where the court stopped the count in Florida. And ultimately, Bush won the election. But interestingly, this is probably the most exhibited work in Rodney's career. It's been shown in many exhibitions and in many different contexts, from group shows to solo exhibitions. And of course, it continues to gain different meaning every time that it's shown.
It's social clairvoyance.
Well, and again, because he's talking about being in the present. So context is everything, and the context will change. The context will change from the moment that you create it to the moment when it's shown, long after you've gone and it's disintegrated and it's pieces that people can collect. The context will be different each time.
Which is really an important aspect of Rodney's thinking, is the continuing presence of history. And he also views history as fiction, which feeds into his interest in speculative fiction and authors like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany and so on, which are referenced directly in a couple of works in the exhibition. I thought we might talk a bit about, we covered a lot of ground, but before we were talking about notions of Black artists turning to abstraction. and perhaps turning away from abstraction. And I thought, Frank, you might want to talk about the case of Leo Twiggs. And so when I saw this exhibition in Charleston, is it still up at the Gibbs?
It's in Florence now.
It's in Florence now.
Until October.
I had never seen the early Leo Twiggs paintings, and when I walked in, I truly thought it was a Hale Woodruff, right? Which I thought was so fascinating. And so maybe you could speak about those and kind of that training that he consumed and then ultimately steered away from, and why he did.
So everyone, I hope, probably knows Leo Twiggs, who is an artist here in the state, and an artist and teacher and educator and intellectual. And he just had a major retrospective at the Gibbs. And I wanted to, in organizing it, show something of his trajectory. And it was organized aesthetically as opposed to simply chronologically. And most people had not seen his early work. His portraits of his wife were very striking because they approach a kind of realism, almost more a sort of social expressionist realism quality. But his early work, the experiments in abstraction, were probably the biggest surprise. And the piece that's on your far right is River's Edge, which is a beautiful work that he made that's a complete abstraction, a complete gestural abstract work, and pretty large scale. And he talks about his struggle with it. He complains that when Hale Woodruff, whom he studied with in New York at New York University, was trying to get him to experiment with abstraction, that he just had to sort of jump in not knowing what he was doing. When I saw this, I thought, wow, because I always notice his compositional structures in the works that he creates, but I did not know he had this kind of talent for structuring an abstract composition. Abstraction is very hard. I know there are a lot of people who still say, oh, the baby could do it. That would be a very talented baby. That's, and that has happened. I've seen some works by very young children that are quite sophisticated in their structure. But organizing the elements in an abstract composition is really a challenge. And he was very adept at this, but he wanted to do narrative. So you see the change here. You have the River's Edge, which is completely abstract, but still alludes to a landscape. So it still alludes to the world that we share of experience. And the next piece, Red Thing, is to me quite obviously a still life. I mean, you can see the table, you can see the apples and things on the table and in bottles. And it has identifiable things, but it has been fully abstracted. And so when I used to talk to my students, I would talk about the difference between something that's fully abstract, something that is not referring to in any direct way to things in the material world, excuse me, as opposed to something that's merely abstracted, which you can still identify the objects, but they've been usually reduced to some sort of purely simplified geometry or to shapes that are very highly subjective. And then the last piece is something he had branched into a completely new medium in stained glass. And in that piece, which is the rose window from the Elmore Chapel at Claflin, he has incorporated multiple elements, the circles and these geometric patterns that were originally influenced by double helixical shapes, because when the patron was Dr. Henry Tisdall at Claflin. And so he wanted to have references to African aesthetics in the stained glass as opposed to traditional Christian iconography in the windows of the church. And so Dr. Twiggs, you can see it more in the vertical windows, but in this circle window, he took elements that he had incorporated into this helixical pattern and wove them into this sort of universe that's in the center of this piece. And so he's very, very adept at going from, because I guess it's unfair if you don't know his figurative work to not have, I didn't include one of those when I sent that to you, I should have. But you can look Leo Twiggs up on your phone.
Well, you said something about abstraction in part being about subjective references to the material world.
Right.
And so this will be the last question that I pose to both of you, and then we'll turn it over to you guys. And so beginning with Michaela, I gave you a preview of this before. Why do we need abstraction?
Yeah, I didn't have a great answer, right? But I think there are conversations that you can't have when you're just dealing with the material world. I think there are conversations that you just can't pose when you're just talking about things that you can grab and touch. We are just more complex beings, and we need the space in the room to have those conversations. Also, just as a practicing artist, I want room to play. And I think that you need abstraction so that you have room to explore, so that you have room to explore different kinds of materials. I am interested in materials that are drawn from human experience. I'm often using discarded materials like Rodney. But I'm also turning them on their heads. I want to see them in a different way. I want to change the context. I want to change the conversation around how we experience those objects. And I want room to play. And I don't want to be restricted. And I think that's a gift of having been born in the 70s, having come behind a generation of Black artists who were exploring abstraction and performance. And I think, you've got to have it.
And I liken abstraction to poetry, whereas realism is literature. There are things that you can say and not say with abstract painting.
And I think there's an opportunity for like a nonlinear narrative. Mm-hmm. You can tell this story, but you don't have to tell it in concrete terms. You don't have to tell it in historical terms. You can seed it anywhere in the universe.
And I'll go straight to an analogy. Of course, everybody here, because you're a museum crowd, you've heard of the idea of the paragone in Italian during the Renaissance, where you compared the visual to the auditory. So you compared music and painting. And music is sound abstraction. It's not showing you anything literal. And so painting is a visual form of that auditory sentiment, or the translation of feeling into something you can see. And so that's why that definition I offer my students of a true abstraction being a material representation of something that really only exists as a conceptual event. That is something I think that certain artists really need. Now, this is the defense that Clement Greenberg and all these people would have put forward with their idea that this abstraction is superior. However, it was predicated in large part upon the distillation of forms from seeing non-Western work, and was seen as something reinvigorating the Western canon. And I'll talk too much, and so we have to go on to something else. But the main thing is that, for me, abstraction is essential because of its greater engagement with a complete subjectivity. Instead of, and the whole idea was it was supposed to be, and I don't say it is, I'm not saying it is, but it was supposed to be this universal form of communication that did not bog itself down in the particulars of the things we all share and experience. It was a way of communicating with line and color and shape and material directly from the soul, the spirit of the artist, into the material to communicate directly to the audience. And that is why I think we need abstraction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, folks. Thank you for coming. Thank you, guys.